Welcome in to the horse race. I'm your host, Daniel Vaughn. We're going to be covering a lot of ground tonight. We're going to be covering the three big stories that are happening to impact the race as we kick off the month of October. And I'm going to go through why these specific three stories are impacting Kamala Harris the hardest and whether or not Donald Trump can use that to gain more ground in this race, gain ground in polling, gain ground when it comes to actual votes, because we're heading into early voting season as more and more states open that up. And so we're just going to cover all that ground. And, this is all taking place in the backdrop of the debate, the vice presidential debate, which happened last night. I'm not going to really cover that because in terms of sort of the broader view of what's happening in this race, that's going to have a smaller impact when compared to the larger news stories that are happening right now. So we're going to start off and we're going to hit sort of a broad overview, specifically with what the New York Times is saying about the race. I find this sort of helpful because it tells you what Democrats are thinking about this moment. The New York Times is sort of the Democratic Party's id, and so it's sort of them thinking out loud. If you used the New York Times editorial board during the peak of when Biden was taking all those shots before he dropped out, you could have used them pretty clearly to sort of tell you where you were in that stage, if Democrats were actually serious about kicking him out or not, whether that drumbeat was loud over time. And you can go to sort of get an idea of what they're thinking by sort of looking through the headlines and looking at the major stories on that. After that, we're going to look through at some of the union voting, because that's going to be important in this race, because it's not necessarily going to Democrats in this race. And so it's important to know how those are being split. And then we're going to wrap up with a look at all the national polling overall and sort of get an idea of where that is and where it might be headed as we move our way towards Election Day. So welcome to October. And we're going to jump in right now, starting off, as I said, with the New York Times. So the first story that we've got up here is called "A Storm, a Strike, and a War Abroad Pose Challenges for Harris." So they're talking about scenes of striking workers, hurricane devastation in the Southeast, and missiles over Israel. They call this a rare moment of turbulence for Kamala Harris. And the reason that this is a rare moment of turbulence for Kamala Harris is because this is negative press for her. There's no way to spin it for Democrats. All three of these major stories in the news right now are negative events for them. So you have Hurricane Helene, which ripped through Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, East Tennessee, and part of Virginia. That has caused widespread devastation. That's going to impact voting, as we're going to get into. And more importantly, for what it means to be president, the recovery efforts for that hurricane are going extremely poor, particularly in North Carolina, which is one of the battleground states for this election. So that is the first major thing. The second thing is the strike at all of the nation's major ports. Democrats have long hanged their election outcomes on whether or not they can bring home that working class vote. A major strike at all the nation's East Coast ports right before an election is a very bad look for Democrats. And when you start looking at some of the polling, it suggests that they are losing ground, and that the unions, in particularly the ones that are involved here, are using the election as a form of leverage over both the Democrats and the management for these different companies. And finally, the war abroad, referencing Israel. This is obviously bad for Harris because she has a wing within her party which is pretty much anti-Israel all the way through and is not interested in helping Israel out, even as it is being attacked by Iran, being attacked by Hezbollah. As Israel has responded in a brilliant fashion, frankly, this is posing a problem for Harris, because the more she comes out and says she supports Israel in some of these endeavors, which are knocking out terrorists, the more that causes problems for her in swing states like Michigan. So we're going to get into some of that too. So this is the challenge for Democrats right now. They face a three-pronged hit here, from a hurricane, from a strike at the nation's ports, and a war that all impacts them negatively. So we're going to start here by hitting the strike and then getting into how that sort of impacts things. So the Wall Street Journal had a good write-up of how the dock workers launched a strike at all major ports. This goes all the way from Maine all the way down to Texas. So literally the entire eastern coastline, as defined by Maine, all the way down through the Texas ports. They're obviously looking for higher wages and other benefits. There's been a lot of stories on all the different splits there. I'm not going to really cover that here. What I did want to note is the major places where the strike is particularly hitting. So you have the New York, New Jersey area is the largest port here up in the Northeast. Maine obviously has one up here too. But the next biggest one here is going to be in Norfolk, Virginia. That's at the mouth of the Chesapeake, and also here in Baltimore at the other end of the Chesapeake. So you've got some areas here with Virginia. Wilmington is a smaller port, but it's in North Carolina, so it can have impact there across the elections. And then Georgia has you have the Savannah port here, which is a very large one. So you have between Georgia and North Carolina, two major ports here, which could impact how, depending on how this strike goes, it could impact how things go on a voting front in both Georgia and North Carolina. And there's even some bleed over effect here in Norfolk. It's at the mouth of the Chesapeake. That's right here on the Virginia, North Carolina border. So you can't really ignore that one either. But there are ports up and down here. And now each one of these has people striking it. And there's a lot of products to move through here. The Wall Street Journal notes that J.P. Morgan has estimated that this will cost 3.8 to 4.5 billion dollars a day. The strike started on October the 1st. We're heading into the third day of it, so this could start adding up quickly. There's currently no reports that we're anywhere close to the strike being ended, just that they're essentially just negotiating through press releases at this point. There's no real signs that they're sitting down and negotiating. And from where things look right now, the unions involved really do look like they want to inflict some pain upon management. So how that looks overall at the end, it's hard to tell, but this is where we are. So here are all your port towns up and down the eastern seaboard, all the way over here to Houston, which is going to be your next major port. So why does this impact the election? Well, because this involves unions, and Democrats have always said that they own the union vote, and that is no longer true. The Teamsters released a statement where they were standing in solidarity with the longshoremen. This was notable because the Teamsters took an explicit shot here at the Biden administration, where they even had profanity in here telling the U.S. government to stay out of the fight and allow union workers to withhold their labor and wages and benefits they have earned. So effectively, the Teamsters want this to be fought out all the way down to the end. And to Joe Biden's credit here, he is acknowledging this threat from the unions and said he's not going to invoke Taft-Hartley. So effectively, if Joe Biden wanted to, he could stop this strike right now, call for a cooling down period, and the sides have to go back to work, and you have negotiations take place. He's not invoking that clause in the law, so you're going to have this strike continue forward. So you have the Teamsters here yelling at him, and you've got his actions not stopping the strike. So that tells you that Democrats are feeling the heat on this front. And if they're feeling the heat and they're not, forcing everything back, because the economic impacts here are big and there are swing state hits here, that they fear stepping in at this stage and stopping the strike more than they do stopping it at all. And so that sort of gives you an idea of where the electoral outcomes are here. Now, this is having some immediate impact. If you've been to a store here, in the last few days, you may have seen people panic buying. The Daily Mail has noted people doing this in places like Virginia. I've heard of stories in here in Tennessee and elsewhere. CNN did a story about how people are panic buying toilet paper. So if you recognize some of these things from the pandemic era, they're back, and it's all happening because of the port strike. I brought up the CNN article because they emphasize in their headline, there's no need for anyone to panic buy, which is true. I think if you look around, there's no need to do this. The problem is everyone remembers COVID-19. That is fresh on everyone's mind. That was only 4 years ago. Everyone witnessed the panic buying, and no one trusted anyone after that. So when you hear there's going to be a potential supply chain shortage, and the union leadership, particularly this guy, has been very clear in saying he wants to have that type of pain, people are going to panic buy. So there's no way around that. So this is one of the reasons that this is bad for Harris and Democrats, because you have Americans panic buying. So you've got empty shelves in grocery stores. You've got striking workers in several battleground states, and of course across the entire eastern seaboard. And this is a bad look for them overall, because if they step in and end it, it looks like they stand against unions. But if they don't step in, then you have these economic impacts where you've got panic buying and other things, which is going to make Americans look at the federal government and say, you're messing up. So This strike has the potential, depending on how long it goes, if it goes longer, it will have a more and more negative impact upon the broader economy, which will in turn have Americans think even less of the Biden economy than they do now. Biden has pointed to a lot of positive economic data, but if you're heading into an election and voters are going into the voting booth saying things are terrible, we have another supply chain shortage crisis, and this is all the fault of Biden and Harris, depending on how they connect that to her, that could get bad real quick for Democrats because you don't want people's last thought when they go into the voting booth to be things are just as bad now as they were during COVID-19. We're back to panic buying. We're back to empty shelves. When is this going to end? So this is why this is a bad news overall. Whether or not you see, Biden push past the Teamsters and some of these other unions remains to be seen. If you see the economic pain really get to increase, he may be forced to do that because the political advantages, one way or another, may shift for him. He may see there if he wants to save Harris's campaign, he may have to actually step in. In the midterms in 2022, he did exactly that. You saw in the railway strike of 2022, Biden induced a cooling off period. He invoked the law. He forced them to the negotiations table. He claimed that he had reached a tentative deal that forced the unions to vote on it, which ended any possibility of a strike through the election day. And then as soon as the midterm elections were over, and some of the unions started rejecting the deal that Biden had put together, Biden rammed that deal through Congress and shoved it down the union's throat. And if you go back and look at a lot of the reporting, and I've got a column out on this week, you had he had a letter from 500 labor historians who blasted this thing. You had labor groups saying that they felt betrayed by Biden ramming this through the railway workers. The Teamsters were very heavily involved in this. So they do not want to repeat of 2022. And so they're not going to let go in 2024 of the political leverage that they have over the federal government in this case. Biden appears to be a little more sensitive to that this time around, so he's not invoking any of the laws that he could to end the strike, and the unions are pushing up their leverage and pushing forward more economic pain. So we'll see if the leverage change, but right now that leverage is pretty squarely in the union's hands, and they are pushing hard on management and using that. We'll see how far that goes. And I've mentioned a few times that that the president, that the Democrats are hurting among union voters, and CNN did a segment on this week. Harry Enton is one of the chief data guys over there, and he was comparing the union vote that Harris has now to previous Democrats. And he noted that Bill Clinton won the union vote by 30 points. Hillary Clinton only won it by 12. And that was the lowest point since 1984. And Kamala Harris is only leading the union vote by 9 points right now. So you have, I've said so far that the Kamala Harris campaign is looking very similar to Hillary Clinton's campaign. And you're seeing more and more of this in some of the data where she is lagging behind where Clinton was, even with union vote. He goes on in this segment to also talk about how the trade vote is also lower for Democrats. And it's also happening across non-white working class voters. So, Black voters, Hispanic voters, Asian, if you're in the working class in this category where you're in a union or you have a trade job, we're seeing their vote shares that normally would go at high numbers, usually like 80, 90% towards Democrats. That has decreased, at least in polling so far. And we've seen this in election results where this number has decreased over time. So this is a red flag for Harris. She has a strike on her hands. She has lower support among unions. The only way that she can expect to overcome this is either to have a polling error in her advantage where this is being overstated in the polls, or she offsets that by winning a lot of college-educated voters. So she has to offset this either through this being just wrong polling or winning another group of voters, in this case specifically white college-educated voters. She can do that. Maybe she can pull it through. But for now, you're looking at trouble for Harris in a lot of these things. So going back here to the hurricane now, the reason that the hurricane is such a bad story for Harris is because it does two things. One, the response is bad. There's no getting around that. And two, it's impacting early voting, and specifically in Georgia, North Carolina, and Florida. Of these states, I would say Harris and Trump are more concerned about North Carolina. Georgia and Florida, Georgia was hit pretty hard, but they should be able to get back quickly, just like Florida is getting set back up quickly. North Carolina, the impact of them was in Western North Carolina, specifically up in the mountains. We could see some impacts in South Carolina too, but I don't think it's going to be quite as drastic as it may be in North Carolina. And you're seeing this now. CNN and some other outlets have had stories about how election officials, they're working hard to try to ensure that they can actually get early voting to happen. So for North Carolina specifically, you're looking at October 17th as the first day when early voting opens. Obviously, the actual election is going to be November 5th, but they have, basically the back half of November after you get to after the 17th, you have as the early voting period. Well, it's the second right now while I'm recording, about to be the third. So they've got 2 weeks here in order to clean up the Western North Carolina and figure out how to get early voting working again in these states. CNN sort of covers some of the things that are sort of happening here, but you've got to remember these are places without water, power, cell service, anything. And with so many of these roads washed out, they're not able to mail out absentee ballots because you can't get mail service out to some of these places. So the only way to vote in many circumstances is going to be to show up. But if you can't physically get to a voting booth, that's going to complicate matters. Now, hopefully, when this opens in 2 weeks, people have a chance to actually, you'll start seeing some of this reopen. But it is trouble for the Harris campaign because this is not going well for them. I wanted to note here, the western part of North Carolina this is the 2020 map of North Carolina, and you have here Asheville here in the western half, and a lot of red here too. So the Asheville metropolitan area has around 400 to 500,000 people in it. So if you see some impacts here, it's unclear which party would impact most, but the people who are going to have the most difficulty getting out to a polling location to vote are going to be the people who are really up in the mountains here and are in all those winding roads and everything that are the hardest to get to now and would be difficult for them to get out, period. How much Asheville is back up and running by the time early voting starts is an open question because they are still relying on Starlink to still do all these things. You've got Elon Musk sending Starlinks in. Storm chasers have been sending them up left and right. I saw Joe Biden announce that he's going to send some Starlinks in too. His number was woeful when you compare it to what a lot of these other private citizens are doing. So the federal response here is poor. Part of the reason is definitely comes down to this being an issue for just being you're in the mountains. It's hard to get around here. But the other issue is that it's just FEMA is failing at its job. And again, we go back to the New York Times, and the New York Times is even saying this here. You've got 6 days after the hurricane. You've got some FEMA aid arriving, but most people are still on their own. So this is a bad look for Harris because she is the face of the federal government. She and Biden are, and she's, you got to do the tours if you're a president or vice president. They are just now doing that. This is after a lot of the governors and state officials have already done tours. So you have Biden and Harris arriving last after everyone else. FEMA aid is not really showing up. And no matter what they say, people are having the realization that they're alone. So this is a bad place to be for Democrats. This is got 4 journalists on this reporting this, and they all basically say the same thing. There's nothing. And you got some FEMA quotes in this story that are just really, really bad. You have here where it's a spokesman for Haywood County saying, we have the National Guard out there, which has been a huge help. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has also arrived, but he added, they're not assisting homeowners yet, but they are assisting us and they're assessing damage. So FEMA is on the scene and it's not helping homeowners. It's helping county and local officials. And I can get why some of that might be happening. But if you're a homeowner, if you're a resident of Western North Carolina and you're looking at this, you're looking at FEMA not do anything for you. The face of that is going to be Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. That is a bad look. And, if they had any wherewithal at all, they would override what is happening right here and tell FEMA, you guys need to go door to door because this is making us look bad. Biden's talking about getting more people on the ground, and that's great. They need all the help that they can get. But these stories coming out now where people are feeling like we're alone, we're not getting help, that's going to have some impact when they enter a voting booth. This is a bad place to be for Democrats. The New York Times also did another piece talking about people being stranded in North Carolina's mountains, and people don't have any idea to what's happening. And again, this picture here kind of tells the whole story. This is a road that's washed out. It is impassable to vehicles. You've got people hiking through here, trying to get through all the debris and damage. That's a very real problem. It's still incumbent upon them to get to them. This is the unfair thing about being president in these types of situations. And it was a thing that George Bush put out during Katrina. He was actively trying to help. Local officials were a lot of the problem and how to do that. But he was the face of FEMA and the federal response, and it was not good. And that was a storm that killed close to 1,400 people. Right now, we're closing in on 200 deaths in North Carolina and the surrounding areas, and there's still hundreds of people missing. So that number could go up depending on what happens here. So this is where we are from North Carolina. You've got the western half of the state basically cut off. Asheville is a blue area here. That could impact Democrats, but you've got all these rural counties here, so that could impact Republicans. So it's too early to tell, but these counties here, when you're closing in on this election, these counties in the western half of North Carolina only have 2 weeks here to figure out how they're going to get early voting set up. And then you got a little more time to get you to election day, but not by much. And in the meantime, everyone's watching what the federal government does and whether or not it does a good job. So that's a very big deal if you're in one of these states. So that's kind of what we're going to covering on the major stories. That sort of gets you up to date on, I know Israel's been dropping bombs left and right on Hezbollah, and Hezbollah's been firing rockets back. That's sort of bad for Harris in Michigan. I'm going to get into Michigan's numbers here. But North Carolina is a state I haven't really covered as a swing state because the polling has sort of been better for Trump than some of the other states. And I have expected it so far to lean towards him. With this hurricane, it is harder to read. And that's going to be particularly true when it comes to polling, because with all the infrastructure out in North Carolina, any polling you do now of this state is going to be inaccurate because you're only going to be getting central and the eastern shore of North Carolina. You're not going to be getting anything out of the western part of this state. And so you have to know when you're reading these polls, they can weight it, they can do whatever they want, but they're not going to know what people are thinking out here because it's going to be impossible to poll this section of the state. So that's a major caveat you have to put on all of North Carolina's polling moving forward. They've been hit by a hurricane and there are power lines, roads, and infrastructure down everywhere. You can't poll this part of the state. So if Harris gets a bump out of this, you can pretty much guarantee it's because they're getting more response out of the bluer areas of the state and the western half is gone. So watch that moving forward. I'm not really going to cover it today because the polling out of North Carolina is basically worthless at this state. But as we start getting more and more of that in, we may go back and look at some of that. Okay, so moving on, we're going to cover the national polls here. There hasn't been a ton of movement overall if you're looking at the real killer politics average. Last week, we were looking at Harris with around a 2.1 advantage. This week, she's at 2.2. And if you look at the line here, this is basically static. There's not a ton of movement here. Trump's sitting at 47%. You've got Harris sitting at 49%. So not really anything that fancy happening here. You'll note here, we do have a cutoff here for the end of the month. Basically, everyone stopped polling as we were heading into the vice presidential debate. Now that the vice presidential debates happened, you're going to see people start pouring in polls here, probably if not late Thursday into Friday, and definitely into the weekend. You'll see new polls drop for October, showcasing what's happening post vice presidential debate. Again, I don't think that's going to move things, but it could give Trump a little bit of air in his sails because J.D. Vance is perceived pretty widely to have won that debate. So Trump could get some movement here, but I would expect, even after all that poll, for Harris to drop no lower than 1.5. That would be a pretty big drop. In reality, I don't expect it to be any more than the same it is here, around 1.8 to 2.2. That seems to be where polling is in the range here. If things change and you start seeing some of these other stories start impacting the news, particularly that strike, if that starts impacting how people see the economy and they see this race, this could get impacted pretty heavily. The race that's getting polled the most is Pennsylvania right now. We have a lot of polling in Pennsylvania, and if you average them all together, it is a dead tie between Harris and Trump. Neither one of them has an advantage. You can sort of, if you wanted to, you could cherry pick your own adventure here. The best Harris poll here is a +5 from Bloomberg. They're one of the more friendly Harris and Biden pollsters out there. You've got another one here from Trafalgar, which is a Republican pollster, which is a Trump +3. But generally, everyone else is showing this as a tie race. Could there be some herding in the polling here? Possibly. But everyone is sort of pointing in the same direction. This is a very close race. So it's anyone's guess what's happening here. But if you're Harris, this is not where you want to be, because if you're looking on this day in history, in 2020, Biden had nearly a 7-point lead and Clinton was leading by 2. Clinton lost the state to 16, and Biden, he had much narrow margins. So if you go back and look at 2020, he had a 7-point lead. It was actually a 1-point lead here by the end of it. So these polls have tended to close and get narrow as the closer we get to election day. They're already showing a narrow race already in Pennsylvania. So any movement in either direction is going to benefit one candidate or the other. And right now, if you're Donald Trump, this is kind of where you want to be. You're just kind of sitting out here, riding through some of these news stories and sort of letting things happen. The next state that has the most inaccurate polling of any of the battleground states is Wisconsin. It is still a razor-thin margin. It's sort of flattened out here with a narrow Harris lead, but it's under a point here. 0.8 is really nothing to write home about. A lot of Democrats will say, you've got these Republican-leaning pollsters here like Remington and Trafalgar, and they're just useless. You don't need to put them in there. But frankly, you just need to – I don't really care. They could have Democratic-leaning pollsters in here, and some of these are leaning towards Democrats. Just throw them in the average. You figure it out later. The likely voting pattern and what different pollsters are saying the election is likely to be like, you just average it out in the end. There's no need to worry about any of that. Narrow race here. This is not really where you want to be if you're Harris. Biden had a 5.8 lead here in 2020, and Clinton had a 4.7-point lead. Clinton notably lost the state in 2016, and Biden had a narrow win here in 2020. So if you're already sitting at narrow margins, this is not really where you want to be if you're Harris. You would likely want a larger lead just to feel like you have a little bit of cushion here, but that's not what she's getting. Michigan continues to be the most weird state to poll, and that is because of the topic of Israel. I mentioned it several times. There is a strong contingent of pro-Palestinian voters in this state, and they do not like Israel at all and are willing to cheer any negative action that comes down upon Israel. They are angry at Biden. It is unclear how much of their anger at Biden is transferred over to Harris. She is trying to balance this, supporting Israel, which is a U.S. ally, while also catering to this group because she does not want to lose Michigan. That's a 1.3-point race here right now. It is also sort of started to narrow up here a little bit, but the range is pretty stable here. You're still talking about around a 1.3. I don't expect this to expand that much. It may narrow down to around a point, like we're seeing in Wisconsin as we get closer to Election Day. But still, this is a close race. So you've got the three, and the reason I'm focusing on the Midwest states is because they are the most important of the battleground states, because what happens there will dictate the importance of the Sun Belt states out west and the rest. So this is what you need to know. What is happening in these races, and most specifically, what is happening in Pennsylvania. That is a dead heat tie. So for all the positive news stories that Kamala Harris has had, she's got a tie race in a lot of these battleground states. You can read that as a positive because Trump is polling better, and you're within striking distance easily in all of these. You can also read it the opposite way, which is this is bad news because in 2016 and 2020 the polls consistently underestimated Donald Trump. If they do that a third time, and you're and the polls are showing a tied race, these are guaranteed losses. So how this ends up going on Election Day is going to depend very heavily on where that final push goes. Do we have a polling error in one direction? Because there typically is always some kind of polling error. And, it can be within the margin of error. If you look at most of these polls, you're looking at 2 to 3 points here as the average margin of error. And in a tie race, that's a pretty big deal. So, it's anyone's guess where these races go. they're showing a tie race down the board. As we get closer to election day, we're going to start getting a more and more accurate idea of where things are likely trending. Whether or not the margin is correct or not is immaterial. What you want to know is what is the trend as we head into election day. The trend line for one candidate over the other can kind of tell you where things are going to end up as you get closer and closer there. So this is where we sit across the swing states. There's a great piece by Texiera in the Liberal Patriot. He's made a point that I've made a lot of times about a lot of these union voters, and he's pointing specifically to these blue wall states for Democrats. And that is Democrats are right now losing the working class. So he makes the point that if Trump's going to win, that you're going to see these 10 states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, they're going to fall because Trump is winning over these working class voters. And, again, you've got a strike across all the Eastern Seaboard, and you've got union voters signaling that they're unhappy with how Biden has treated them in the past. How this all ends up, fixing itself as we get to election day is anyone's guess. But if Harris underperforms with those voters, she's going to be in deep trouble because union and trade workers are very heavily represented across Wisconsin, Western Pennsylvania in particular, and in Michigan. And then the state to watch after that is going to be North Carolina because it's my belief, and I'll take a look here just so we show you what's happening here. Trump has a lead here. Again, I don't know how much you can take stock in that because you're saying a Harris surge here. Is that surge real, or are we seeing something here that's hurricane related? That's impossible to tell. So I generally think you cannot trust North Carolina's polling from here on out because you're not going to get a good cross section of the state. So that's all the major stories impacting the news right now and where we are in polling. That's all I've got for this week. So look forward to talking to you next week when we will cover all the latest and get you up to date. Thanks for stopping by, and I'll talk to you guys later.